So I hope you enjoyed the morning. I really did. I thought it was a lovely start, and I loved what Chip had to say and his deep emotion whenever he talks about his father in particular. And it's really something, when that deep emotion comes out of us. And sometimes it just sneaks up on us, we're not expecting it. And then it's there. And I know there have been times where it could have been the second school that Chip and I did. I don't think Sid was there. I think he missed that school. He kicked off the first school in Victoria and Sydney, and then the second school, I think we were on our own, and the third and final school was where the DVD, The Ultimate Answer, came from, was Sid's last talk to us all, was at that school. But in the second school, we were on our own, and it was still so fresh to us, kind of the feeling that we knew Sid wasn't going to be with us much longer, and it felt like a tremendous gift and privilege to do the school and offer what we could for the school and to keep Sid's message alive as best as we could, along with all the other wonderful practitioners in the world today. And we were just talking away, letting it flow, letting it just come out. And somebody asked us a question about halfway through the day and said, could you say something about the principles? He said, it's been so interesting because not once have you really defined the principles. He said, you've, if anything, deconstructed them. And we've just all got a beautiful feeling. But he said, I've never been to any other class or course like this one, where you deconstructed the principles. And I didn't know what that meant. I still don't really know what that means. But I got such a feeling from the depth of what he said. And as time went on, later I got more of a logic from behind what he said. But it was the feeling, it was the energy that I experienced when he said that, because I started to shake from the energy, because I just wasn't used to that amount of energy. And it was like my physical body couldn't handle that amount of energy. And I just was kind of shaking with the energy, and I couldn't talk. And Chip just took over and talked beautifully. And I'd never experienced that amount of energy before. And I just want to share that, because sometimes it sneaks up on us. Like, there's no way on God's earth I was expecting something like that amount of energy. And later on, the logic, again, the information that came to me about this deconstruction of the principles is, first and foremost, that you don't have to understand. You don't have to understand the principles and how they work. And what else is there in the world today that you don't have to understand intellectually, and yet the feeling that you get from the inside out, the power of the feeling, the profundity of the feeling that us mortals can get, is such evidence of who we are, of our spiritual nature. And the human nature part of me was the quivering of trying to absorb that amount of energy that my body could hardly take it. It did. And the deconstruction of the principles, for a long time, the only principle I had a feeling for was thought, because that was the first insight that came to me. Thought creates feeling. We've heard it 1,000 times. I've heard it 1,000 times. 44 years later, that insight continues to work for me. It continues to feed me with newness and more depth of understanding. And that's the thing. Like I had one principle I could hang my hat on when I went to start to share. When Sid would say, okay, well, would you come with me to this trip? We've been invited here and to this university in Oregon, and I'd like you to come and just share your story. Well, what do I have to share? Like I have one little insight. And so it seemed like, how long is that going to take? Thought creates feeling, and then what? Then what do I do? And so it was very interesting because it was Sid's faith in that principle. Like he knew that I'd heard something. I knew I heard something too. I knew that. And I knew that it was coming from me, that it wasn't coming from him. He wasn't in the room. He had left. And it came to me while I was enraged. And how beautiful is that? How much hope is that for humanity? That you can be gripped by fierce anger and still your spiritual nature can come through. That's the power we have inside of us. And yet, although I knew it was coming from inside out, and I had such an overwhelming feeling of gratitude and a feeling of worthiness, that phrase was clear to me. But even more important than that phrase, that information, was where it came from. That it came from me, it came from mind. And that was kind of part of the deconstruction, is because I had a mental image and a mental belief system of what mind was, and it wasn't me. I had no conception of what mind was, and yet somehow in that insight, I knew it came from me, and that was what was most important, not the words. They were incredibly powerful, but it was the fact that, oh my goodness, I do have something in me. What Sid has been saying all along, that everybody has this birthright. Everybody has this wisdom inside. Yeah, I'd go, sure, it's okay for you to say this, but that I just don't buy it. And so it was where the insight came from that was proof of the pudding. Like I knew it came from me. It didn't have anything to do with Sid at that moment. Because he had talked about thought in the 1.5 years of resistance. He had talked about thought when I asked him. And when I asked him and he responded, it was most annoying, because I didn't want to hear. And so Ken and I would invite him to our home and invite him for dinner, and it got, in my anger and resistance, I got bolder in my confrontation to him. And he would just kind of twinkle at me when I would give them this ultimatum, like, we'd love to have you over for dinner on the condition that you don't talk about this nonsense. And he'd go, okay, dearie, that's fine. And then despite myself, I would find myself asking him a question. And often it was about thought. And then he had the audacity to answer. And it was like, gee, Sid, I asked you not to talk about this. And he said, well, dearie, you just asked me a question, so, how can that be? And so that's the deconstruction. It's like, to me, deconstruction of the principles mean you don't have to understand them. You can't really understand them. You get glimmers of them. But more than anything, you get a sense of them, a feeling of them. And so it kind of deconstructs the words. That's what I see now. It deconstructs the words or the definitions that we think are so important. And I remember towards the last 1.5 years or so of Sid being with us, he really talked with Chip and I in particular about the school and how his vision for the school. And at one point, I arrived at his doorstep before Chip did, and Sid said to me, okay, so could you describe, how do you see the principles? Because you're going to be asked this at the school. And I said, gosh, Sid, can you imagine trying to define the principles to the man who discovered them? It'd be like trying to, a little bit like trying to say to Einstein, what his definition of, what was it, Chip?
The theory of relativity.
The theory of relativity, And so I kind of froze in my tracks to try to define them to him. But I remember saying to him, Sid, I have a sense of them. I have a feeling for them, that there's something inside of us. And so that's it, like I have a sense of them. And he said, well, that's all you need. That's all you need, dearie. If you have a sense of them, I quote, he said, that's a degree of knowing. You know how in his tapes he'd go, there's listening and listening. There's hearing and hearing. There's knowing and there's knowing. And he said, when you have a sense of them, he said, that's a degree of knowing. And I thought, wow, and just welled up. That's, to me, the deconstruction of the principles. That you don't have to understand them. And yet, the beauty and the mystery is that as time goes on and the depth of your feeling continues to grow, you will be able to define them. You'll be able to wrap some words around from what's real to you. Like at one point, about a year ago, I saw with a little more depth, that we're all the principles in action, what I said this morning. And that made a world of difference to me. It settled me down so much because I could see more deeply that there's nothing to look for because we are what we're looking for. And I got a glimmer more of we're mind, like we're where the insights come from. That's us. They're not coming from space. They're not coming from somebody else. They're coming from us. And so I realized I'm mind. I realized like a little glimmer of that I'm mind. And you're mind. And you're mind. And everybody is mind. And same as consciousness. Like consciousness, again, I remember this experience with Sid when Chip and I were doing some conference calls, still on the phone. And Chip and I were quite excited about these conference calls with a group that a client had asked us to talk to, a large group. And we really got into it and thoroughly enjoyed it and the engagement back and forth. And they were saying to us, gosh, if Sid would ever come on one of these calls, we'd love to have him on one of these calls. So Chip and I mentioned that to Sid. They'd love to have you, Sid, It would just be such a privilege. And he said, no, you and Chip do that. He wasn't interested. And then the next day he called Chip and said, well, why don't you and Elsie come over to my home? And I'll just sit in on it. I'll be in the back of my office and I'll just sit in on it. And so we went to his office and Chip and I started, and there was something about consciousness. And I was talking about my experience of consciousness as if it was out there, like it was this big consciousness in the world. And Sid stopped me, like just bang, like that. And he said, Elsie, he said, it's your consciousness. When you have a shift in understanding, it's your consciousness. Like you had a shift. It's not this consciousness out there. You are consciousness. And it shocked me. It deconstructed my understanding of consciousness, big time. And it deconstructed my concept of consciousness so deeply that I couldn't talk. And so Chip talked a little bit, and then Sid came to the forefront, and he just kind of took over and talked. I'll never forget that, because I saw more deeply as time went on again, but that was the start of it for me, that I'm consciousness in action, as we all are. And when I see something, see something, that's consciousness in action. And that has been so helpful because it helped me see beyond behavior. It helped me see beyond my behavior, and it helped me see beyond others' behavior. Because when I didn't see, when I was still like about consciousness out there, that kind of consciousness was awareness of what I did wrong. That's how I was brought up with my religious background, was being conscious of what you did wrong, and then you atoned for it. And this consciousness, our birthright from inside out, was aware of my spiritual being. And when you're aware of your spiritual being to a degree, behavior is like minimal. Like what's behavior? Right? The difference between behavior and a spiritual being. Like the balance. Spiritual being and behavior. So I was less affected by behavior. And I could be gentler with myself when I did something wrong, so-called wrong. And I began to see it, it's evolution. It's not wrong. It's just learning and playing this contact sport with grace, as Chip talked about earlier, with grace. And then thought, the deconstruction for me of thought was, it's so not about my thinking. That's too late. I'm not interested in my thinking or anybody else's thinking for that matter. And I used to love my thinking. And I used to love everybody else's thinking. Tell me more about your thinking. And then, you'd really get into it, really work it. I'd work it. Man, I'd work it. And then the behavior would increase. But I got a feeling for the power of thought as a creative agency, that as human beings, we have this incredible power to create our experience. And that's what became important to me, was the power behind life. And that's who we are. And it's at the same time so simple and so profound. And then you just live your learning. So that's all I want to offer at this point, is see it in yourselves. Really look at how beautiful you are as human beings and as spiritual beings, and how they are so perfectly aligned.